Marissa Blake had never expected peace. Not real peace anyway, but she thought she might find at least a manageable version of it in the suburb of Northbridge. It was quiet, well manicured, and the houses looked like they'd been dipped in expensive paint and frozen in time. She had bought the house for her son, not herself. Jamie needed space, access to specialists, clean air, and above all, stability. The cul-de-sac was lined with freshly mowed lawns and polite smiles, the kind that lasted exactly long enough to register and disappeared just before you could return them. The neighbors didn't wave with familiarity. They acknowledged existence and retreated into their perfect little fortresses. For Marissa, this was fine. She was too tired to care about potlucks and block parties. Working nights as a paramedic and raising a child with a neurogenic bladder condition didn't leave space for muffins and gossip. Jamie was 10. Diagnosed early, he had undergone a series of surgeries by the time he was 6 and now relied on a catheter and external urostomy bag to live comfortably. Marissa was meticulous about hygiene and maintenance. She had a system in place that kept everything discreet and safe. During the day, Jamie often played in the shaded part of the yard, where they had set up a medical-grade support stand with a hook for the bag, camouflaged in the corner, away from view. It was temporary, but necessary. The indoor air was often too stuffy for long hours, and the child needed sunlight as much as he needed dignity. When Marissa moved in, she had informed the property management office about Jamie's needs. They gave her vague approval, nothing in writing, just a nod and a "shouldn't be a problem," which at the time seemed enough. It wasn't. The first few weeks passed with mild tension, the kind you couldn't name but could feel. Glances held half a second too long, conversations that quieted as she approached, a trash bin knocked over twice, which she chalked up to wind. But then Karen happened. Karen Kimball lived 3 houses down and had the type of face that had aged with precision. Her hair was always done, her lips were always coated in the exact same color, somewhere between plum and blood, and she walked with the self-appointed authority of a local monarch. Karen introduced herself with that sickly sweet tone that always carried a warning. She was watching. "Welcome to Northbridge," she had said, handing Marissa a printout of the community rules before even asking her name. "I'm one of the resident coordinators for the Property Standards Committee. We take pride in our aesthetic continuity. I'm sure you understand." Marissa, already exhausted from the move, had nodded politely and stuffed the paper into the nearest drawer. Karen didn't speak to Jamie directly. She would smile at him from afar, but it was always that empty kind of smile children could sense wasn't real. Jamie didn't like her. He said she felt shiny and cold. Marissa told him to just be polite and stay out of her way. It was good advice at the time. It didn't last long. The incident that changed everything was small, almost petty. Except it wasn't. Marissa came home after a double shift one night and found the medical stand gone. At first she thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, but it wasn't anywhere in the yard. Jamie, curled up on the couch with his handheld game, looked up and said, "The lady with the loud shoes took it." Marissa froze. "What do you mean?" "She came in while I was outside and said it looked like a trash rack. She just took it and walked away." Marissa didn't sleep that night. She emailed the property office. She knocked on Karen's door. No answer. The next morning, she found the stand. Bent, scratched, and thrown upside down into the communal garbage bin on top of a bag of lawn clippings. That would have been the end of it if not for what was taped to her mailbox later that week. A letter with a generic header, unsigned, stating that visible medical waste equipment was not in compliance with community visibility standards and that failure to remove such items might result in corrective action. The wording was vague on purpose. It wasn't a rule, it was a message. Marissa started documenting everything. Photos, dates, times. Not because she thought she'd need to sue someone, but because she knew what it meant when people pretended to be civil while treating you like garbage. It always started with paper. Paper gave people the illusion of justification. She also started locking the new medical stand inside when it wasn't in use. Still, more notes followed. Some slipped into her mailbox, others left on her windshield. Jamie came home crying one afternoon after a neighbor's child had called him Pea Monster. It only got worse when someone spray-painted a crude yellow arrow pointing from the sidewalk toward her property line with the word hazard in dripping black paint. That night, she cried in the bathroom with the water running, not wanting Jamie to hear. She reached out to a local disability advocate for advice, and they confirmed what she already feared. Unless she could prove harassment or denial of accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, no one would help her. Keep documentation, they told her. Don't react emotionally. Stay methodical. That would have been easier if it weren't for Jamie. His sleeping got worse. He stopped wanting to go outside. Once, she caught him trying to wear an oversized hoodie over the catheter tubes despite the heat. When she asked him why, he said, "So people stop staring." Marissa didn't know how to tell him they were never going to stop. And then came the moment she broke. She returned from a shift to find something wedged inside her front gate. A plastic bag tied off at the top, filled with liquid. At first, she thought it was garbage, but when she opened it, the sharp ammonia smell hit her in the face like a slap. It was urine. Someone had taken one of Jamie's sealed Europacks from the medical bin, perhaps the ones left for pickup, and left it for her as a message. There was no note. Just the smell, the weight, and the knowledge that someone had gone through her child's waste to humiliate her. That was the moment something shifted in her. Not rage, not tears, not vengeance, just precision, cold, heavy clarity. She didn't tell Jamie. She didn't even clean it up immediately. She took a photo. Then she put on gloves, sealed the bag, and stored it in the freezer, in case she needed it for evidence. After that, she began preparing not for a complaint, but for a campaign. She reread the state housing laws. She called a civil rights attorney. She filed a formal ADA notice. She gathered witness accounts from her son's care team, school liaison, and even a retired nurse friend who had visited during one of the earlier confrontations. And she knew she couldn't count on her neighbors. But she could count on paper. Paper didn't blink when you stared back. Karen didn't know any of this. As far as she could see, Marissa had retreated. The yard was quiet. No more arguments. The medical stand was no longer visible during the day. Jamie rarely came outside. She had won, in her own mind. But what she didn't realize was that the silence was not surrender. It was strategy. The same kind Marissa used every night on the ambulance when things went from calm to chaos and someone had to take control without screaming. There were worse things than paper. Much worse. And Karen was going to find that out. The official complaint arrived on a Monday afternoon, folded in a thick envelope with the same detached politeness that had defined every confrontation so far. It wasn't from Karen directly, of course. She never put her name on paper when someone else could do it for her. Instead, the letter came from the local property compliance office, the kind that claimed neutrality while echoing the loudest voices behind closed doors. The wording was familiar, bureaucratic, and evasive. Following multiple reports concerning unsanitary conditions and improper disposal of medical materials, we are compelled to conduct a formal review of your residence under Section 9.3 of Neighborhood Environmental Safety Guidelines. As a temporary precaution, we are advising removal of all exterior medical support devices from public view. Failure to comply within 10 business days may result in citation or administrative escalation. Marisa didn't scream or cry. She sat at the kitchen table, reread the letter twice, then neatly placed it beside the pile of photographs, emails, and annotated community notes she'd already begun collecting. The timing was intentional. 10 days overlapped with Jamie's next round of catheter replacement procedures, an exhausting and uncomfortable week when his mobility was already limited, when keeping him indoors too long made him nauseated and restless. The suggestion to remove exterior devices wasn't just impractical, it was dangerous. But that, of course, was the point. The complaint didn't care about medical necessity. It cared about visibility, about image, about the illusion that no one here suffered or leaked or cried behind closed blinds. The next morning, she sent a response, formal, carefully worded, and stamped with attachments: physician's notes, procedural guides, equipment documentation, and a signed affidavit from Jamie's care provider explaining the necessity of outdoor airflow and access for certain medical routines. She CC'd her lawyer. She CC'd the Department of Fair Housing. And then she waited. But there was no waiting in Northbridge. Not really. Every day that passed came with its own subtle retaliations. The garbage collection schedule for her side of the street was mysteriously delayed. Flyers advertising alternative family health care options were stuffed into her mailbox. Someone left a scented air freshener hanging from the branch near the fence line, as if the mere presence of her son's condition was now assumed to be polluting the neighborhood atmosphere. Jamie asked fewer questions. He stayed in his room longer, only coming out when she called him for food or to check on the bag flow. He had stopped sleeping through the night entirely. Once, at 3 a.m., she found him standing in the hallway, barefoot, wrapped in his blanket, staring at the front door. "Are they coming again?" he asked, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. She didn't know how to answer. She didn't want to lie, but the truth was far too heavy for him to carry. 2 days later, Marisa noticed a cluster of unfamiliar cars parked just beyond the cul-de-sac, lined in a way that looked more like surveillance than coincidence. From her window, she watched as 3 women with clipboards stood near the sidewalk, whispering and pointing, once directly toward her house. When she stepped outside to ask what they were doing, they smiled mechanically and introduced themselves as community observers conducting a routine standards survey. They refused to answer questions, took photos of her property, and left before she could get their names. When she reported the incident, the property office claimed to have no record of scheduled inspections. The official she spoke to offered a tired apology and hung up mid-sentence. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was orchestration. Later that week, a bright yellow sticker appeared on the back window of her car. It read, "Caution, Biohazard Transport Zone." The adhesive was industrial strength. It took her an hour and half a bottle of solvent to remove it. She called the police, not to file a report, but to force something into the public record. The officer who came was young, distracted, and visibly uncomfortable. He didn't write much down, but he walked the perimeter of the property, made a few notes, and said someone from the non-emergency division would follow up. They didn't. Meanwhile, Karen remained maddeningly distant. She no longer made remarks or gestures. She didn't attend the Friday wine circle that usually gathered near the communal fire pit. She wasn't seen at the pool or mailbox or even walking her tiny, perfectly groomed dog. Her silence, however, was anything but peaceful. Marisa knew that she was working behind the curtain, whispering just loud enough to stir discomfort, never loud enough to be caught. It was the kind of manipulation that left no fingerprints but always left bruises. What broke the thin membrane of civility was what happened next. Someone tampered with the medical waste bin. It wasn't a violent act, no smashed containers, no graffiti, no theft, but it was worse in its precision. Marissa had placed the sealed Europacks inside the labeled medical waste box outside the garage, as she did every Thursday night before scheduled pickup. The bin was clearly marked, secured with a snap lid, and elevated on a platform to prevent tampering from animals or accidental spillage. That Friday morning, she stepped outside to find the lid open, the interior still intact but dusted in a strange, white, granular substance, powdery, almost crystalline. There was no odor, no obvious spill, but something was wrong. She didn't touch anything. She called the disposal service first, then her lawyer, then the police. This time, the response was more formal. A forensics unit came. They sealed off the area with tape, took samples, and even interviewed her neighbors, though none of them claimed to have seen anything. Karen was not among those questioned. No charges were filed. The powder turned out to be non-toxic, something akin to dehumidifier residue or powdered detergent, but the message was clear. Someone had come close enough to touch what shouldn't be touched. Someone wanted her to feel penetrated, unsafe, exposed. It worked. Jamie refused to go outside at all that weekend. He watched cartoons on mute, curled on the couch like he used to when he was 5 and afraid of thunder. Marissa stayed by the door. The final straw came in the most mundane form possible. A notice on the door. Unlike the last ones, this wasn't typed. It was handwritten, all caps, in thick black marker. The ink had bled slightly, making the letters look swollen and angry. If you won't clean up after your retard, then leave. No signature, no hint of cowardice, just cruelty boiled down into words that stung more than anything physical ever could. She stood at the door for a long time, gripping the handle, barely breathing. When Jamie asked what it said, she told him it was junk mail. She burned the letter in the sink that night, not out of panic, but control. She was done preserving evidence. Now she was preserving herself. The next morning, she resumed everything as if nothing had happened. She replaced the medical stand. She sterilized every surface. She called the Department of Justice Disability Rights line and demanded a case number. She filed a formal ADA complaint against the property management. She requested an emergency review hearing with the Housing Oversight Board. And then, calmly, she retrieved one of the unused sealed Europacks, placed it inside an insulated tote, and set it on her kitchen counter. Not out of rage, not as threat, but as intent. She didn't know what she was going to do yet, but she knew what she was no longer going to allow. And in the silence that followed, in the days of held breath and murmured phone calls and tightly shut windows, she waited, not for rescue, not for apology, but for the next line to be crossed. Because it would be. She had no illusions about mercy, not in a place like this, not with people like them. 3 days after the last incident, Marissa noticed that the rhythm of the neighborhood had shifted. Not outwardly. There were still dog walkers, lawn sprinklers misting the sidewalks, and slow-moving SUVs with tinted windows patrolling the crescent-shaped street. But beneath the surface, something had calcified. She could feel it in the silence that met her at the mailbox, in the way conversations among neighbors cut off like a guillotine when she turned the corner. Even the children, who once played freely along the curb, now stuck closer to their porches, casting glances toward her driveway with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. Revulsion, maybe, or fear, passed down from whispered warnings behind closed doors. That Monday morning, as she loaded Jamie's medical supplies into the car for a routine outpatient visit, she noticed the graffiti for the first time. On the sidewalk, sprayed in a faded mustard color, was a crude arrow pointing toward her property, followed by the word urine in smeared block letters. It wasn't fresh, probably a day or two old, but it had been carefully avoided by the foot traffic on the street, as though acknowledging it meant risking contamination. She took a photo and sent it to her lawyer without a word. The response came an hour later, brief but supportive. Documented, filed, remain non-confrontational. Marisa didn't need to be told that twice. She had already internalized the quiet war tactics of the neighborhood. Still, the escalation had shifted from psychological to territorial. She began checking the perimeter every morning. Fence lines, garbage bins, front porch. One morning, she found her garden hose unspooled and wrapped around the medical waste bin like a snake. Another time, someone had unscrewed the solar lights along the walkway and shoved them bulb first into the ground, as if trying to bury them alive. These were not the acts of bored kids. They were precise, symbolic, and designed to be unsettling without being traceable. Jamie withdrew further. He stopped drawing, stopped asking questions, stopped insisting on wearing his favorite hoodie with the comic book character that once made him feel brave. Now he wore plain clothes, sat in corners, and rarely spoke unless prompted. Marisa tried to reach him in small ways: movie nights, comfort food, old music he used to dance to. But it was like trying to comfort a child during a hurricane with an umbrella. His silence wasn't rebellion. It was fear made flesh. At night, he would cling to his heated blanket and mumble in his sleep, words she could barely understand except for one repeated phrase: "Don't let them see." The next act of aggression came from the garbage collectors. Normally, her medical waste pickup was scheduled and private, handled by a third-party service with appropriate licensing. But one morning, as she returned home from a store run, she found the entire medical waste bin, sealed, locked, and clearly labeled, dumped across her driveway. The lid had been pried open, and the contents were splayed across the asphalt like a crime scene. Sealed pouches, latex gloves, sterile wraps, even a catheter kit still in its sterile packaging. Nothing was torn or broken, but everything had been arranged as if on display. There was no note, no spray paint, no laughter from nearby houses, just the sense that someone had spent time, possibly hours, turning her home into a grotesque exhibition. She didn't scream. She took photos. She collected each item with gloved hands and returned them to the bin. Then she left a voicemail for her attorney, then one for the medical waste company, and finally a third for the disability rights investigator now assigned to her ADA case. She was tired of waiting for dignity. She would settle for accountability. That same day, she received an anonymous package on her doorstep. It was a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a single black-and-white photocopy of a photograph, a grainy image of Jamie taken from behind the fence as he sat outside with his bag connected, eyes closed in the sun. Across the bottom, in red ink, were the words, "You're making us sick." She stared at it for a long time, holding it in her bare hands as if trying to transfer the poison from paper into her skin. And then, without ceremony, she slid it into a file folder and labeled it Threat Number 1. Her lawyer insisted on involving the police again, but Marisa was already several steps ahead. She had submitted a formal petition for protective surveillance. The Property Management Office, now facing pressure from both legal channels and disability compliance auditors, responded with a limp internal memo stating that All reports of property conflict are taken seriously, and offering to mediate a conversation between her and the community representative. That was the moment Marisa realized Karen had officially declared war using a title. Not content with passive aggression, she had now assumed a semi-official role under the guise of neighborly oversight, wearing the mask of civic responsibility while orchestrating harassment through silence and delegation. The next day, Jamie was followed home from school by 2 boys from the neighborhood, older, possibly middle school. When he came through the front door, his pants were wet. At first, Marisa thought it was a bag leak or catheter issue, but he shook his head and whispered, "They threw water at me. Called it your piss." She filed a report with the school. The principal promised to investigate, but her voice carried the usual weightless apology that came with suburban discomfort. "We understand this is difficult, but children mimic what they hear at home." Something in Marisa cracked that night. Not in fury, not in sadness, but in calculation. She took Jamie's Europacks, stored as usual in the biohazard container, and labeled each one with the date and time of collection. She wasn't preparing for war, she was preparing for court. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. A new community rule proposal appeared on the neighborhood website. All yard-facing medical devices or health-related equipment must be registered and shielded from visibility to maintain community appearance standards. The proposal did not name Marisa, but it didn't need to. The timing and language were surgical. The neighborhood had learned the art of cruelty with plausible deniability. By the end of the week, 5 new motion-activated lights were installed on the property line between Marisa's yard and Karen's. They weren't aimed inward, for security, but outward, directed at Marisa's porch, bathing her front steps in bright artificial light every time she opened the door. Late one night, unable to sleep, Marisa stepped outside with a cup of tea and stood beneath the blinding flood of Karen's perimeter lighting. She didn't flinch or retreat. She simply stood still, letting the spotlight sear her outline into the lawn like a target. Jamie watched from the window, his eyes wide, saying nothing. She stood there for 7 minutes. Then she turned, walked back inside, and began to make a list. An actual list, titled "When the Line Breaks," with subcategories: psychological, physical, legal, medical. She listed everything from property tampering to emotional trauma, to the hospital bills for stress-induced migraines Jamie had suffered since the ordeal began. She even began tallying sleep hours lost, missed shifts, and social isolation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about pattern recognition. She was a paramedic, after all. She knew how to triage chaos, how to respond to systems in failure. What was happening in her life now wasn't a personal vendetta. It was a structural infection. The neighborhood wasn't trying to kill her with one blow. It was trying to bleed her out through exhaustion, hoping she'd disappear before anyone in authority realized she'd been targeted. But Marisa had no intention of disappearing. She intended to be seen. And not just in Karen's artificial floodlights, but on paper, in courtrooms, in oversight offices, in front of every board and council with the power to condemn what was unfolding under the banner of community values. And yet, for all her resolve, it was Jamie's face that haunted her. He had lost the shine in his eyes. The one child who had once said, "Mom, you're the strongest person in the world," now barely looked her in the eye. So when she finally broke her silence, when she finally took the first Europack and walked to Karen's property in the dead of night, it wasn't out of vengeance or spectacle. It was ritual, a declaration, a boundary, one that Karen would never forget. The call from the housing oversight investigator came at 8:47 a.m., while Marisa was folding Jamie's laundry on the living room floor. Her hands, still trembling from lack of sleep and tension accumulated over weeks of orchestrated hostility, instinctively froze mid-fold as the voice on the line introduced itself with clipped professionalism. It wasn't a courtesy call. It was notification that her formal ADA complaint had triggered a scheduled review hearing, and that a local compliance officer would be conducting a site visit within the next 72 hours to evaluate the legitimacy of the reports against her as well as the retaliatory conduct she had documented. For a moment, she just sat there, holding a wrinkled T-shirt that Jamie had outgrown 2 months earlier, and let the silence fill her chest like air rushing into a collapsing lung. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just exhaled and nodded, as if the voice on the other end could see her. She had done everything right. She had followed every rule, collected every paper, filed every letter. And now, finally, someone outside this cul-de-sac would be forced to see the rot beneath the freshly painted fences. She spent the next 2 days not preparing her home, but preparing her mind. Jamie had been taken to his grandmother's house for the weekend, a rare exception she permitted only because he had started refusing to eat unless someone else sat next to him. Without him there, the house felt still, clinical, like the inside of an ambulance after a failed call. Marisa cleaned with the precision of someone who knew they'd be judged on every stray fiber, every out-of-place document. She reprinted photos, receipts, medical records, time-stamped emails, even phone logs from the nights when vandalism had occurred. She organized them not as a victim, but as an analyst. She was no longer just a mother under siege. She was a witness, building a case. When the compliance officer arrived, he was polite but guarded, middle-aged, dressed in a button-down shirt too stiff for comfort, with a leather folio under one arm and a government ID clipped to his belt. He did not smile. He did not comfort. He did not joke. And that Marisa appreciated. She walked him through everything without embellishment. She showed him the sidewalk graffiti, the security footage still stored from the tampering incident, the photo of the anonymous letter, and the powder-laced bin. She handed over every item he asked for, including a spreadsheet she'd made detailing every interaction Jamie had endured at school since the community conflict began. The officer made no comment, only taking notes in a series of tight, looping, cursive marks. When they stepped outside to examine the placement of the medical support equipment, he paused for a long time at the corner of the yard where Jamie's stand was usually placed. Marisa had reinstalled it 2 nights before, deciding that compliance shouldn't mean concealment. The officer crouched slightly, examining the base, the protective cover, and the surrounding area for residue or biohazard flags. Then he stood up, nodded once, and said, "There's no violation here, not even close." That sentence didn't feel like victory. It felt like air after being held underwater for too long. Marisa didn't reply. She simply walked back to the door with the officer in silence, letting the statement echo in her bones. Before leaving, he handed her a document acknowledging the official nature of his review and informed her that a full report would be filed within the week. Depending on findings, he added, administrative actions may be taken against anyone found to have violated ADA protections or retaliated against a protected party. And with that, he was gone. By that evening, the silence around her home had changed in texture. It wasn't just tension, it was recalibration. The neighbors were still quiet, but there was now a visible pullback in their body language. The glances were less direct, the passive aggression less precise. Karen, however, remained defiantly unchanged. That same night, Marisa found a fresh sign staked at the edge of the shared boundary between their properties. It read, "This yard is a private health area. Do not approach. Do not contaminate." The font was the same as all the previous anonymous printouts that had circulated in mailboxes. But this time, the sign had Karen's name typed at the bottom. Provided in partnership with Karen Kimball, Community Health Liaison. There was no such position. The sign wasn't a threat. It was bait. A dare to react. A trap dressed in formal language. Marisa didn't take it. She left the sign alone. Instead, she copied it, documented it, and forwarded it directly to the Oversight Board's investigator. Within 24 hours, she received a response. The sign constituted a misrepresentation of authority and targeted stigmatization of a disabled minor. It would be included in the case file. That should have ended it. But predators don't retreat when they're challenged. They evolve. The following weekend, someone began leaving anonymous flyers at the community center bulletin board. They weren't directly about Marisa or Jamie. Too smart for that. Instead, they were warnings dressed as concern. Community alert. Improper waste handling threatens your family's safety. And, is your yard next? Each flyer featured stock images of children playing near syringes and discarded tubing, accompanied by statistics pulled from questionable blogs about contamination from home medical equipment. Marisa took down the flyers and scanned them, adding them to the expanding archive on her laptop, which now resembled an evidence locker more than a family computer. But the effect of the flyers wasn't just social. It was psychological. One evening, as she stepped out to retrieve the mail, she saw a woman from 2 streets over walking her dog abruptly cross to the other side of the road the moment she saw Marisa approaching. She said nothing, didn't even glance at her, just crossed, as if there were an invisible quarantine zone radiating from Marisa's home. That night, for the first time, Marisa didn't just feel angry or exhausted. She felt afraid, not for herself, but for what this was doing to Jamie. Fear that he would internalize the message that his body was offensive, that his care made others uncomfortable, that needing help made him less than human. She sat in the dark for a long time that night, staring at the still, blue-lit silhouette of his empty room. And, for the first time since this began, she allowed herself to say the word that had hovered beneath every moment, every threat, every cold glance. Hate. Not discomfort, not concern. Hate. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to feel like she didn't belong on the planet. That was the turning point. Not the visit, not the threats, not even the sign. It was the realization that this wasn't just neighborly malice. It was institutional rot disguised as community order. A rot that would keep growing if no one forced it into the light. And she knew then, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't going to leave. Not now, not ever. It began with the disappearance of water. Not the household supply, nothing as dramatic or cinematic as that, but the outdoor access. One morning, as Marisa was preparing to rinse the medical stand in the side yard after an early bag change for Jamie, she turned the spigot and heard nothing. No hiss, no sputter, no resistance. Just a dry clink and silence. At first, she thought it was a pipe issue, but when she checked the other outdoor faucet, it too had been disconnected. The metal cap was missing. When she called a plumber to inspect it, he frowned and showed her that the main shutoff valves for external water had been tampered with. Tools used to strip the heads off the connectors so the valves couldn't be turned by hand. The replacements would take days, and the parts were specialized. She filed a police report, again, and submitted another set of photos to her lawyer and the disability rights investigator, whose replies were now faster and less formal, punctuated by phrases like documented and added, and pattern consistent with targeted obstruction. That phrase lodged in her mind. Targeted obstruction. It wasn't vandalism anymore. It was strategy. Someone was calculating what would chip away at her support systems without drawing blood. Limit water flow, compromise sanitation. Make it harder to clean, harder to care, harder to maintain what dignity remained. But the water was only the first step. 2 nights later, the lights went out. Not in the house, but in the yard. The floodlight Marisa had installed near the medical setup blinked twice and died. When she went out to check the motion sensor unit, she found the entire casing shattered. The bulb filaments cracked and scattered like ash. Beneath it, scratched into the wood post in what looked like a screwdriver tip, were the words, "No one wants to see that." Not signed, not even punctuated. Just a statement, carved like a law into her property. Marisa didn't even hesitate. She filed a report. She took photos. She replaced the light. She added another camera to the porch, this time angled low, aimed directly at the path leading to the fence gap where the intruder likely came in. She didn't tell Jamie. He had started to smile again in small ways, sometimes laughing softly when the nurse told jokes or when their dog barked at squirrels. She wouldn't take that from him. Not again. That weekend, Jamie's access to the community playground was revoked. It came in the form of a polite email from the community amenities coordinator, stating that, due to recent sanitation concerns and unverified medical equipment activity, access to common-use areas was being restricted to residents in full compliance with visibility and health standards. Marisa's property, it noted, was under ongoing review. The phrase, unverified medical equipment activity, was so deliberately absurd it bordered on surreal. She forwarded the message to her attorney, then called the Department of Housing. The representative on the other end was silent for several beats before sighing audibly and saying, "They're testing you. This is calculated noncompliance, designed to provoke a reaction or a mistake." Marisa didn't make mistakes. She adjusted. She set up a makeshift play area in their driveway, repurposing collapsible gym mats and portable canopies to give Jamie space to move. She coordinated with a therapy consultant to ensure his physical activity stayed consistent. And she made it very, very public. Not in a flashy or confrontational way. There were no signs, no posters, no loud declarations. But every time someone walked by, they saw a boy playing in his yard, using medical equipment safely, under his mother's watchful eye. And it drove them mad. One morning, a bag of shredded latex gloves was dumped on their front steps. Another time, their mail was soaked in bleach. Letters fused together in a mush of white chemical pulp. The mail carrier filed a federal complaint after Marisa reported the incident. Even then, the neighborhood's response was silence. Not a single person asked if she needed help. No one checked in. She was becoming invisible by design, erased from the polite consciousness of Northbridge so the ugliness could remain unspoken. But not everyone remained complicit. One neighbor, a soft-spoken woman named Claudia, who lived 2 doors down and whose adult son used a wheelchair, approached Marisa one afternoon while pretending to adjust her hedge. Without turning her head, she said, "They did this to me, too. Not like this, but the same shape. They told me his ramp broke the line of the lawn." Her voice was dry, almost brittle. "They told me I could be part of the community aesthetic, or I could be a problem. I chose problem." Then she walked away, leaving a single envelope tucked into the bush. Inside were photocopies of internal neighborhood emails, committee meeting minutes, and a list of anonymous complaint submissions, all with Karen's name flagged either as author or approver. It was a gold mine. Marissa added it to the file, cross-referenced the timestamps, and sent it to both her lawyer and the ADA investigator. For the first time, the response came with a timestamp, pursuing formal citation and review hearing. Legal exposure increasing. That same day, Marissa received an official summons to appear at a private hearing with the neighborhood board to address ongoing tension and non-compliance. It wasn't a request, it was a trap, but she didn't flinch. She walked into that hearing alone. No lawyer, no backup, no fanfare. Just a folder in her hands and the memory of her son crying at night because kids threw bottles at him and said he leaked. The room was filled with 5 members of the board, 3 men, 2 women, all wearing the expression of people who had already decided their position but still pretended to care about appearances. Karen sat at the far end, arms crossed, her mouth curled in that smug, brittle smirk she wore like armor. The chairman welcomed her with a monotone greeting and immediately opened with, "We've received multiple reports of discomfort among neighbors and safety concerns related to your son's medical setup. Would you care to explain why this continues to be a public issue?" Marissa didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she opened the folder and began placing documents on the table, one by one. Physician letters, ADA protocols, inspection clearance reports, photos, video stills, threat letters, graffiti, vandalism reports, the bleach-soaked mail, the tampered locks, the carved wood, and finally, the anonymous flyers, each stamped with metadata tracing their uploads to the community email server accessed through Karen's IP address. When she finished, she looked each board member in the eye, pausing for just long enough to let discomfort grow into guilt. "You didn't call this meeting to help," she said calmly. "You called it to make this go away. But I'm not going away. And if you don't act now, this entire board will be named in the civil rights suit I've already begun preparing." Karen laughed, a dry, hollow rasp that bounced awkwardly off the panel walls. But no one else joined her. One board member cleared her throat. Another looked away. The chairman sighed and said they'd adjourn for private discussion. Marissa stood, collected her documents, and left without another word. 2 days later, she received an email stating that the hearing's findings were inconclusive, but no punitive measures would be pursued against her at this time. Translation: "You scared us, but not enough to admit fault." She didn't need their admission. She already had everything she needed. The file was ready. The investigator had everything. And now, the Department of Civil Rights was involved. Karen didn't stop. Of course she didn't. Within a week, Marissa's tires were slashed. Police filed it as vandalism. Jamie's school bus started arriving late. Sometimes not at all. The driver later admitted, sheepishly, that a complaint had been filed about contamination risk, and his supervisor instructed him to adjust the route. Marissa drove Jamie herself, every morning, every night, because she wouldn't let the system teach him that his body was a burden. She would show him what standing meant, even when standing cost everything. And then came the night she'd never forget. A Tuesday. Windless, too quiet. Marissa was closing the blinds when she saw something odd on the lawn. A glint of plastic? She stepped outside and found a Europack, one of Jamie's used bags, sliced open and laid out on the center of the grass like a flag. But it wasn't one she had disposed of. It had been taken from her medical waste bin, cut deliberately, and arranged with surgical precision. There were no words, no note, just the sickly smell and the thick, slow stain soaking into the grass. That was the last time she allowed herself to wait. That night, she didn't call anyone. She put on gloves, collected the bag, and sealed it. Then she walked into her garage and retrieved the cooler where she'd been storing evidence. She didn't look at it like waste anymore. It wasn't waste. It was proof. It was weight. It was power. And early that next morning, as the sun began to rise and the world blinked back into routine, Marisa walked to Karen's perfectly manicured lawn with that same calm silence she used when delivering bad news to families in the ER. She didn't flinch. She didn't hurry. She opened the cooler, took one of the sealed, dated packs, and emptied it across the rows of roses lining the fence. Not wildly, not messily, with precision, like a statement, like a ritual. She left before anyone saw her, but the lawn would remember. By morning, the smell had started to rise. Not immediately, not in some dramatic wave of decay, but slowly, insidiously, like guilt moving through a congregation. The sun warmed the liquid, and Karen's roses, so proudly regimented along the edge of her yard, began to wither in uneven patches, turning brown at the roots and wilting at the edges as if scorched from beneath. Marisa had gone to work as usual, shift at the ER, 12 hours long, relentless and indifferent to the quiet civil war unfolding back home. She hadn't told anyone what she had done, not even her attorney, not even the rights investigator who had become almost a colleague by now. It wasn't an act of retaliation. It wasn't some desperate plea for attention or media spectacle. It was communication, direct, wordless, brutal. She had learned that in trauma care, sometimes when words failed, the body had to speak. By the time she returned that evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. Anxious murmurs, half-finished conversations halted by the sound of her approaching car, curtains shifting like eyelids, doorsteps inexplicably populated by neighbors who hadn't spoken to her in weeks. They weren't there to welcome her. They were waiting for confirmation. That night, Karen stood at the edge of her lawn, hands on her hips, staring down at the damage with a tension in her spine that looked almost martial. She didn't scream. She didn't march over. She didn't even look at Marisa directly. But a photo was taken. Marisa saw the flash from 2 houses down. The next morning, it was on the local neighborhood forum, in a thread titled, "Biohazard Attack. Is this what our community has come to?" The comments were what she expected. Some were outraged, others gleefully vicious, still others performatively neutral, calls for both sides to stop the madness. But no one mentioned Jamie. No one acknowledged the cruelty that had preceded it. No one wondered why someone might be driven to such a decision. They only asked how fast it could be cleaned up. The summons came 2 days later. Not a hearing this time. An actual lawsuit. Karen had filed a civil complaint for public endangerment, exposure to biological waste, and psychological distress. She claimed her home was uninhabitable due to deliberate contamination from a known medical source. She included photos, timestamps, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen Marisa walking toward the lawn in the early hours. It was, in a twisted way, the most honest Karen had ever been. She didn't cloak this move in regulation or bylaws. She was just angry, outraged, humiliated, and finally, vulnerable. Marisa received the notice on a Friday. She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the same drawer where she had kept Jamie's medical invoices, her late husband's death certificate, and the first letter she'd ever received from the neighborhood years ago, the one that said, "Welcome." "We maintain a standard." Her attorney called her that evening and asked only one question. "Are we ready?" And Marisa said, "Yes." The court date was set 2 weeks out. In that time, the Department of Civil Rights escalated their investigation. A formal complaint was now on record with the State Housing Authority. A parallel inquiry was opened by the ADA Division regarding coordinated harassment against a minor with medical needs. Depositions began. Karen, to her visible discomfort, was required to answer under oath. Marisa didn't attend the depositions in person, but she read the transcripts late into the night. Karen's careful language, her attempt to paint herself as a guardian of community safety, her avoidance of direct responsibility. But when asked whether she had ever personally interacted with Jamie or made any effort to understand his medical condition, she paused, then said, "That's not my responsibility." The silence in the transcript that followed was deafening. At home, things remained tense but hollow. The neighborhood had begun to fracture under the pressure. Claudia, the neighbor who had once shared the internal emails, informed Marisa that at least 3 other residents had filed anonymous amicus briefs in support of her ADA claim. One of them, apparently, was a board member who had previously voted in favor of enforcing visibility codes. "People are scared now," Claudia said. "Not of you, of her, of what she's made this place into." Jamie sensed the change, too. He began asking questions again, not fearful, but curious. "Is it almost over?" he asked one morning while Marisa helped him with a new catheter insertion. She paused, looking down at his small, careful hands, trying to mimic her movements. "Not yet," she said, "but it will be." The trial was brief but brutal. Karen's legal team presented the contamination as an act of aggression, citing health statutes and biohazard laws. Marisa's team responded with a mountain of documentation: videos, letters, internal memos, harassment complaints, property damage reports, disability rights statutes, medical necessity protocols, and, most damning of all, the series of ignored pleas for accommodation that had gone unanswered for over 6 months. The ADA investigator testified. So did a doctor. So did Claudia. So did the mother of another disabled child who had once lived on the far end of the block and moved out after being told her daughter's wheelchair ramp made the property unmarketable. Marisa did not cry on the stand. She spoke plainly, with clipped clarity, the kind that comes from years of delivering hard truths to strangers in trauma rooms. When asked if she had poured her son's waste onto Karen's lawn, she said, "Yes." When asked why, she answered, "Because she already made him feel like one." The room went silent. Even Karen didn't speak. She just sat there, jaw clenched, knuckles white, and for once, without her signature smirk. The judge deliberated for 3 hours. The ruling dismissed Karen's complaint, citing lack of physical harm and overwhelming evidence of provocation and discriminatory targeting. The decision included a formal censure of the neighborhood board for negligence and allowed Marisa's ADA and civil rights complaints to proceed unimpeded. The court recognized what Marisa had been trying to prove since day one, that this wasn't just about landscaping or bylaws or lawn aesthetics. It was about exclusion, control, and the quiet weaponization of social norms against the vulnerable. Karen left the courtroom in silence, surrounded by her now fractured allies, none of whom met her gaze. Marisa remained seated, staring at the floor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't relieved. She was just still. It wasn't over. Not really. But it had broken. And breaking was the first step toward rebuilding. The weeks that followed moved slowly, not with the inertia of grief, but with the strange, quiet drag of a system realigning itself after being forced to acknowledge its own sickness. The board didn't issue a formal apology, but the language of their communications shifted. The once sterile, vaguely menacing emails gave way to neutral, almost embarrassingly polite notices. The visibility codes vanished from the community guidelines, replaced with phrasing about reasonable accommodations in compliance with federal standards. A new liaison position was created, one that included actual oversight from disability advocates, not self-appointed tyrants like Karen. The roses along her fence never recovered. Marissa passed them daily, watching them curl deeper into decay, the leaves mottled, stems blackened and dry, as if the soil itself refused to nourish anything born of cruelty. Karen no longer made appearances at the mailbox or in her front yard. The dog, once so carefully paraded on its matching leash and bandana, was no longer seen at all. Rumors spread that she had been suspended from the board indefinitely and was selling the house, though no sign ever appeared on the lawn. It didn't matter. She was gone, whether physically or in presence, exiled by her own hand, undone not by spectacle, but by her insistence on controlling a world that no longer tolerated her kind of quiet violence. For Jamie, the change came slowly, like muscle memory returning after an injury. At first, he remained cautious, clinging to routine as though it were armor. He still asked Marissa to check the porch before he stepped outside. He still double-checked the medical bag's seal, even though he knew it was secure. But one afternoon, weeks after the final ruling, he wandered out to the driveway with his sketch pad and sat in the sun, drawing without asking if it was safe. Marissa watched him from the kitchen window, a dull ache blooming in her chest. Not sorrow this time, but something warmer, something that almost felt like healing. She didn't disturb him. She let him exist. That was the point of all of it. The disability rights case moved forward, now backed by state authority and public scrutiny. Depositions expanded, documents were requested, and the investigation widened to include not just Marissa's case, but at least 4 others that surfaced in the aftermath. Families who had left, who had been pushed out quietly, not with eviction notices, but with the erosion of tolerance. The neighborhood, once known for its manicured perfection and faux-welcoming culture, was now being watched. Marissa received a formal letter from the Department of Civil Rights acknowledging that her documentation had contributed materially to the advancement of a critical investigation into systemic, exclusionary practices. It was not justice. But it was movement. The day Jamie returned to the community playground, he did it without prompting. He walked there with his backpack and a comic book, no fanfare, no announcement. A few other kids were already there, including one boy who had previously thrown a bottle at him. Marissa watched from the car, her hands tight around the steering wheel, unsure if she should intervene. But Jamie walked past the boy without flinching, climbed onto the shaded bench, and opened his book. A few minutes later, the boy approached him, not to provoke, but to sit beside him. No words, just proximity. And that was enough. The rest would come in time, or it wouldn't. Either way, Jamie was visible again, not as a spectacle, not as a target, but as a child who belonged where he chose to stand. Marissa never publicly discussed what she did to Karen's lawn. She didn't explain it, didn't justify it, didn't repeat it. The act had spoken, and in its wake, the neighborhood had been forced to listen. Her lawyer advised her to be cautious, and she was. But she didn't hide. She continued to walk the property at night, checking perimeters, making sure everything Jamie needed remained intact and unbothered. One evening, Claudia walked up with 2 cups of coffee and simply sat beside her on the porch. No words, just solidarity. When the new board elections came, no one asked Marissa to run. But several residents, including ones who had previously ignored her, knocked on her door and asked who she would support. She gave them names, people who had spoken up, who had changed their minds publicly, who had chosen courage over comfort. The election results were different this time. The power structure had shifted, not completely, but enough to matter. One night, as Jamie lay curled in bed beside her, half asleep with his fingers wrapped around her wrist like he used to when he was small, he whispered, "I'm not scared of them anymore." Marisa didn't answer. She just kissed the top of his head and stared at the ceiling, her chest tight with something that was not pride or relief or even triumph. It was clarity. She had survived. He had survived. But more importantly, they had refused to disappear. Outside, the night was quiet. Not the suffocating silence of fear, but the kind that follows a storm. A silence that held space, not secrets. And for the first time in a long while, Marisa believed it might last.